the Opposition, the Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I join with the Prime Minister in his comments about Jonathan Sachs? Can I also send all of our thoughts to those affected by the terrible events in Saudi Arabia this morning? Can I welcome the victory of President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris, a new era of decency, integrity and compassion in the White House? And can I also welcome the fantastic news about a possible breakthrough in the vaccine? It's early days, but this will give hope to millions of people that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Mr Speaker, today is Armistice Day, and I'm sure the whole House will join me in praising the remarkable work of the veterans' charities such as Help for Heroes and the Royal British Legion. Like many other charities, Help for Heroes has seen significant drop in its funding during this pandemic, and they're now having to take very difficult decisions about redundancies and keeping open recovery centres for veterans. So can the Prime Minister commit today that the government will do whatever it can to make sure our armed force charities have the support that they need so that they can carry on supporting our veterans?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr Speaker, and I echo entirely what the Right Honourable Gentleman says about Help for Heroes. It's a quite remarkable charity and does wonderful things for veterans. And in these difficult times, many charities are, of course, finding it tough. In addition to what the government is doing to support charities through cutting VAT on their cutting business rates on their premises and cutting VAT on their shops, Mr Speaker, I would also urge everybody, wherever possible, to make online contributions to charities that are currently struggling.
I thank the Prime Minister for his reply. The truth is the Chancellor's package for Forces charities was just £6 million during this pandemic, and that's just not sufficient. Can I ask the Prime Minister to reconsider that support on their behalf? Because at the same time, we've all seen this weekend that the government can find £670,000 for PR consultants. And, Mr Speaker, that's the tip of the iceberg. New research today shows that the government has spent at least £130 million of taxpayers' money on PR companies, and that's this year alone. Does the Prime Minister think that that's a reasonable use of taxpayers' money?
Mr Speaker, I think he's referring to the Vaccines Task Force, and after days in which the Labour Party has attacked the Vaccines Task Force, I think it might be in order for him to pay tribute to them for securing 40 million doses. And by the way, the expenditure to which he refers was to help raise awareness of vaccines, to fight the anti-vaxxers, Mr Speaker, and to persuade the people of this country, 300,000, to take part in trials without which we can't have vaccines, Mr Speaker. So I think you should take it back.
Keir Starmer.
Mr Speaker, nobody's attacking individuals. Everybody's supporting the vaccine. £130 million, Prime Minister. There's a real question about the way that contracts are being awarded, about basic transparency and accountability. And I know the Prime Minister doesn't like that. This is not the Prime Minister's money, Mr Speaker. It's taxpayers' money. The Prime Minister may well not know the value of the pound in his pocket, but the people who send us here do, and they expect us to spend it wisely. Let me illustrate an example of the government's lax attitude to taxpayers' money. Earlier this year, the government paid about £150 million to a company called Iandel Capital to deliver face masks. Can the Prime Minister tell the House how many usable face masks were actually provided to NHS workers on the front line under that contract?
Mr Speaker, we're in the middle of a global pandemic in which this government has so far secured and delivered 32 billion items of personal protective equipment. And yes, it is absolutely correct, Mr Speaker, that it's been necessary to work with the private sector, with manufacturers who provide equipment such as this, some of them more effectively than others, Mr Speaker. But it's the private sector that in the end makes the PPE. It's the private sector that provides the testing equipment, Mr Speaker, and it's the private sector that, no matter how much the party opposite may hate them, it's the private sector that provides the vaccines and the scientific breakthroughs, Mr Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
The answer is none. Not a single face mask at a cost of £150 million. Mr Speaker, that's not an isolated example. We already know that consultants are being paid £7,000 a day to work on test and trace, and a company called Randox has been given a contract without process for £347 million. That's the same company that had to recall 750,000 unused COVID tests earlier this summer on safety grounds. And there's a sharp contrast between the way the government sprays money at companies who don't deliver and their reluctance to provide long-term support to businesses and working people at the sharp end of this crisis. The Chancellor spent months saying that extending furlough was, these were his words, not the kind of certainty that British businesses or British workers need, only then to do a U-turn at the last minute. Yesterday's unemployment figures show the cost of that delay. Redundancies up by a record 181,000 in the last quarter. What's the Prime Minister's message to those that have lost their jobs because of the Chancellor's delay?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with great respect to the right honourable gentleman, he knows full well that the furlough programme has continued throughout this pandemic. It went right the way through to October. It's now going through to March. It's one of the most generous programmes in the world. 80% of income supported by this government. An overall package of £210 billion, Mr. Speaker, going in to support jobs, families and livelihoods throughout this country. I think this country can be very proud of the way we've looked after the entire population when we are going to continue to do so. And he should bear in mind, Mr. Speaker, that the net effect of those furlough programmes, all the provision that we have made, is disproportionately beneficial for the poorest and neediest in society, which is what One Nation conservatism is all about, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister must know that because the furlough wasn't extended until the last minute, thousands of people were laid off. And the figures tell a different story. Redundancies, as I say, record high, 181,000, 780,000 off the payroll since March. ONS saying unemployment is rising sharply. So much for putting their arms around everybody. The trouble is that the British people are paying the price for the mistakes of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. If they'd handed contracts to companies that could deliver, public money would have been saved. If they'd extended furlough sooner, jobs would have been saved. If they'd brought in a circuit breaker when the science said so, lives would have been saved. Let me deal with another mistake. The Chancellor's repeatedly failed to close gaps in support for the self-employed. Millions are affected by this. It's bad enough to have made that mistake in March. But 7 months on, the Institute of Fiscal Studies says the scheme remains, their words, wasteful and badly targeted for the self-employed. The Institute of Directors, many self-employed continue to be left out in the cold. After 7 months and so many warnings, why are the Chancellor and the Prime Minister still failing our self-employed?
Mr. Speaker, unquestionably this pandemic has been hard on the people of this country, and unquestionably there are people who have suffered throughout the pandemic and people whose livelihoods have suffered. But we have done everything that we possibly can to help. And as for the self-employed, Mr. Speaker, 2.6 million of them have received support at a cost of £13 billion. Quite right, Mr. Speaker. We've also, of course, as he knows, uprated universal credit. That will continue until next year, Mr. Speaker. He now champions universal credit, by the way, and calls for its uprating to be extended. He stood on a manifesto, Mr. Speaker, to abolish universal credit.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister just doesn't get it. I know very well that the self-employment income support scheme has been extended, but the Prime Minister must know that that scheme simply doesn't apply to millions of self-employed people. They've been left out for 7 months. And there's a real human cost to this. This week on LBC, I spoke to a self-employed photographer called Chris. He said to me, our industry's been devastated. There's 3 million of us that have fallen through the cracks. Our businesses are falling, absolutely falling, and crashing each day. He asked me to raise that with the Chancellor. I'll do the next best thing. What would the Prime Minister say to Chris and millions like him who are desperately waiting for the Chancellor to address this injustice?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I would say to Chris and what I say to the right honourable gentleman and to the whole country is the best way to get his job working again, the best way to get this country back on its feet is to continue on the path that we are of driving the virus down. And I'm grateful to the people. This is a week, Mr. Speaker, since we entered into the tough autumn measures that we're now in. I'm grateful to the people of this country for the sacrifices that they're making. And I'm particularly grateful to the people of Liverpool. And elsewhere who are now taking part, tens of thousands of people in Liverpool, taking part in the mass testing work that's going on there. And it's fantastic news that we now have the realistic prospect of a vaccine, Mr. Speaker. But science has given us two big boxing gloves, as it were, with which to pummel this virus, but neither of them is capable of delivering a knockout blow on its own. And that's why this country needs to continue to work hard to keep discipline and to observe the measures that we've put in. And I'm grateful to the party opposite, grateful for the support that they're now giving for those measures. That is the way to do it, Mr. Speaker. Hands, face, space, follow the guidance, protect the NHS and save lives.